Sir, my mother has your blood medallion too. 6 words, spoken by a 9-year-old girl with scraped knees and a gap-toothed smile. And the vampire king forgot how to breathe. Not from fear. Kings like him didn't feel fear. Not from hunters, not from assassins, not from 6 centuries of enemies who had all, eventually ended up dead. But his coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. His heart, a heart that hadn't raced in over 100 years, suddenly forgot how to be still. Because only one blood medallion was ever forged. History was certain of it. Kingdoms had been built on that certainty. So how did this child, standing on a sunlit sidewalk in a torn pink dress, know it existed at all? Whatever answer waited behind her innocent brown eyes was about to unravel a secret buried for 9 years. A secret with a stolen woman, a broken promise, and a debt 600 years in the making. It started on an ordinary afternoon. It would not end that way. 20 minutes earlier there had been nothing ordinary seeming about it at all, which was exactly how Cassian liked it. The awning of Café de Lumière threw long amber stripes across the cobblestones as the afternoon light softened toward evening. At a small table near the window sat a man with a porcelain cup of black coffee, cooling untouched in front of him. He wore no crown that anyone would recognize as one, just a dark velvet coat, rings on scarred fingers, pale hair pulled loose over broad shoulders. To the humans drifting past with their shopping bags and their phones, he was simply a striking stranger, enjoying the last warmth of the day. King Cassian Vale came to this street once a season, always disguised, always unnoticed. He had ruled long enough to know that laws written in a throne room meant nothing if a king forgot what it felt like to sit among the people he governed. So he sat. He watched. He listened to a city that had no idea it was being watched by something far older than its oldest stone. A few tables away, a girl in a patched pink dress was doing what she always did outside this cafe, talking to strangers. Mila Hart had grown up an orphan, but she had never grown up guarded. She believed, with the stubborn faith only a child could carry through 5 straight years of disappointment, that her mother was still alive somewhere, waiting. So she talked to everyone, because you never knew which stranger might finally say, "Yes, I know where your mother is." Today it was the man with the crimson medallion. Mila stopped in front of his table, tilted her head, pointed without a trace of hesitation. "Sir, my mother has your blood medallion too." Cassian's hand stopped halfway to his cup. For a moment, 600 years of careful composure simply evaporated. His breath caught somewhere behind his ribs and refused to move. The sound of the street, footsteps, laughter, a violinist 2 doors down, dimmed into nothing. "What did you say?" His voice came out quieter than he meant it to. Mila blinked up at him, unbothered by the sudden weight in his eyes. "My mom's ring. It's just like yours. Red stone, cracked gold. Right in the middle." She shrugged the way children shrug at things that have simply always been true. "She keeps it hidden, though. Says it's not safe to show people." Cassian said nothing for a long moment. He knew, with a certainty carved into memory itself, that only one blood medallion had ever been forged, the one resting against his own chest at this very moment. Its twin was a secret so old that even his own court had stopped speaking of it generations ago. If a piece of it now hung around the neck of a stranger's mother, then everything his family had believed for nearly a decade was built on a lie someone had worked very hard to keep buried. "Where is your mother now?" he asked gently. Mila's smile faltered, just slightly. "She's not around anymore. Everyone says she died in a fire, but I don't believe them." She said it simply, like a fact she'd repeated so many times it had worn smooth, like a stone in a river. "Before we got separated, she gave me this." She tugged a small wooden pendant free from beneath her collar and held it up proudly. "She said we'd find each other again. So I don't believe the fire story. Not even a little." Cassian studied her face. No fear, no deception, just the unshakable certainty of a child who had never once let go. He rose from the table with slow, careful movements, though his mind was already racing 3 steps ahead of him. He asked her name. He asked where she lived. And when Rowan Mercer, his oldest friend, and the only man alive who could read Cassian's stillness as alarm, appeared at his shoulder moments later, Cassian didn't need to explain anything. Rowan had seen his king go this quiet only once before, centuries ago, the night his brother died. "Your Majesty," Rowan murmured. watching the girl skip back toward the orphanage gate at the end of the street. No child should know what that medallion is. Cassian's eyes stayed fixed on her small, retreating shape. She doesn't know what it is, he said quietly. She only knows her mother has one. He paused. And I think I know exactly who her mother is. Rowan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Elise kept the promise, Cassian whispered almost to himself, which means someone else broke it. Rowan's eyes stayed on the girl's retreating shape long after she vanished around the corner. It's a trap, he said flatly. It has to be. Nobody just walks up to a disguised king and mentions the blood medallion by accident. Someone sent her. Someone's watching right now, waiting to see how you react. Cassian didn't answer immediately. He was still staring down the empty street, his coffee forgotten, cold in its cup. She's 9 years old, Rowan. Children can be used. You know that better than anyone. Look at me and tell me you believe that girl was lying. Cassian finally turned, and there was something in his expression Rowan hadn't seen in a long time. Not suspicion, not calculation, something closer to grief. She wasn't reciting lines. She wasn't watching my face for a reaction. She was just talking. The way children talk when they've told a story so many times it stopped feeling like a story to them. Rowan hesitated. He had built his entire purpose around protecting Cassian from exactly this kind of moment. A stranger who slipped past 6 centuries of caution with 6 simple words. But he had also learned over 300 years at Cassian's side that his king's instincts about people were rarely wrong. Then explain it to me, Rowan said, because I don't understand how a random orphan knows about a medallion that isn't supposed to exist. Neither do I, Cassian admitted. Not yet. He sat back down, slower this time, and gestured for Rowan to take the seat across from him. Find her again, quietly. I want to know everything. Where she lives, who raised her, what she remembers about her mother. Don't frighten her. Don't approach her like a threat. And if it is a trap, then we'll know soon enough. But I won't treat a grieving child like an assassin, because it would be easier than facing the alternative. It didn't take long. Mila, it turned out, was not difficult to find, nor difficult to talk to. She lived at Hope Haven Orphanage, 3 streets over. And when Rowan approached her gently near the courtyard gate, introducing himself only as a friend of the man from the cafe, she answered his questions with the same open, unguarded honesty she'd shown Cassian. Her mother's name was Elise Hart. She had disappeared in a fire when Mila was 4. Mila had never believed the story, not because she had proof, but because her mother had promised that they would find each other again, and her mother had never once broken a promise before that day. She gave me this, Mila said, showing Rowan the same small wooden pendant. Right before everything happened, she said to keep it safe. She said it would matter someday. When Rowan relayed all of this back to Cassian that evening, in the quiet of the king's private study, he watched something shift behind his king's eyes. Recognition sudden and absolute, like a door swinging open onto a room long sealed shut. Elise Hart, Cassian repeated softly. You know the name? Cassian didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out at the darkened city below, and let the memory pull him back 9 years, to a night he had spent most of a decade trying not to think about. 9 years earlier. He remembered the pain first, a deep tearing wound across his ribs, the kind that should have healed in minutes but wouldn't, because the blade that made it had been forged specifically to slow a vampire's healing long enough to finish the job. He remembered the hunters closing in behind him, torches and iron, and the particular hatred of men who believed they were doing holy work. He remembered collapsing behind a row of crates in an alley behind a hospital, certain, for the first time in centuries, that this might be how it ended. And he remembered her, a young nurse finishing a night shift, who found a wounded stranger bleeding out in the alley and didn't scream, didn't run, didn't ask what kind of creature he was even as she saw wounds no human weapon should have caused, and no human body could have survived. She simply knelt beside him and began working. Elise Hart never asked his name, never asked why hunters were chasing him, or why his blood ran too dark, or why his eyes, when he finally opened them, held 600 years of memory behind them. She treated him in secret, in the back room of a shuttered clinic, night after night, asking for nothing in return except that he live. By the time he was strong enough to leave, he understood something rare had found him. A woman who had helped a stranger not out of fear or ambition, but simply because it was the right thing to do, before he vanished back into the night. Cassian had broken one of the oldest traditions of his bloodline. He removed the hidden second half of the blood medallion, the twin no history book had ever recorded, the one his family had kept concealed for centuries, and placed it in her hands. "If you or your family ever need help," he told her, "my family will protect yours. This is my promise. It does not expire. It does not forget." Elise had wept, quietly, and pressed the medallion to her chest. He had never seen her again. Present Cassian's hand tightened against the windowsill. Elise Hart, a nurse who vanished 9 years ago in a fire no one could properly explain. A daughter who refused, against all reason, to believe her mother was dead. A wooden pendant kept safe for years, exactly as promised. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a trap. It was a debt, finally coming due. "Your Majesty?" Rowan asked, watching the color drain slightly from his king's face. "What is it?" Cassian turned from the window, and for the first time since the cafe his voice was steady, not with calm, but with the particular clarity of a man who finally understood the shape of the danger in front of him. "Elise kept the promise," he whispered, "which means someone else broke it." Hope Haven Orphanage sat at the quiet end of a cobbled lane, its brick facade softened by ivy and years of careful patching. Cassian arrived the next afternoon, dressed as plainly as a nobleman ever could manage, introducing himself only as a family friend looking to help with the donation. It wasn't entirely a lie. It was, perhaps, the truest thing he'd said in years. The director, a warm but tired woman named Mrs. Bellamy, welcomed him without suspicion. Children rarely received unexpected visitors who weren't there to inspect the plumbing or complain about noise, and a well-dressed stranger offering funds for new beds and books was not a thing she questioned too closely. "Mila's told us about you," she said, leading him through the courtyard. "The man from the cafe." Cassian's chest tightened slightly. "She talks about it often?" "She talks about everything often." "Mrs. Colt." Bellamy smiled, though there was something careful behind it. "She's a good girl, bright, kind to the younger ones, but she carries something the others don't." She paused near a doorway, lowering her voice. "The other children who come here eventually accept what happened to their families. Mila never has. 9 years, and she still believes her mother is out there somewhere." "What does the staff believe?" Mrs. Pear, Bellamy's expression, flickered with something like pity. "We believe what the reports said. There was a fire. Her mother didn't survive it. It's not easy for a child to accept that kind of loss, and we've never pushed her to. But she's the only one who insists there's more to the story." Cassian said nothing, filing the words away carefully. He found Mila in the courtyard a few minutes later, sitting cross-legged near a flower bed with 2 younger children, showing them how to fold paper birds. She lit up the moment she saw him. "You came back." "I did." "Oh." "I sanquadinion for apting at church." She abandoned the paper birds instantly, pulling him by the sleeve toward a bench beneath a crooked old tree, chattering the entire way about the orphanage, about the caretakers, about a boy named Toby who ate paste when he thought no one was looking. Cassian listened to all of it with more patience than he'd shown anyone in decades. Eventually, she reached beneath her collar and pulled free the small wooden pendant again, holding it out for him to examine properly for the first time. "This is the only thing I have from her," Mila said. "Everyone says I should let it go. Miss Bellamy says remembering too hard isn't healthy." Her voice dropped, stubborn and small. "But I don't want to let it go. If I stop remembering, it's like she really did die, and I know she didn't." Cassian turned the pendant gently in his fingers. The wood was old, worn smooth by years of small hands, carved with a pattern he couldn't quite place in the fading light. "What makes you so certain?" "Because she promised." Mila said it like it was the only law that had ever mattered. "She told me no matter what happens, we find each other again." She never broke a promise. Not once, not ever. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket next, a child's drawing, faded and creased from years of handling, depicting 2 figures holding hands beneath a sun with too many rays. "I drew this the week before everything happened. That's her." She pointed. "She used to sing before bed. I don't remember the words anymore, just that she sang." Cassian looked at the drawing a long moment, something tightening in his chest that he hadn't expected. He had spent centuries watching kingdoms rise and empires burn, and none of it had ever moved him quite like the quiet, fierce loyalty of a child who refused to let her mother become a memory. "I believe you," he said finally. Mila looked up at him, startled. "You do?" "I do, and I intend to find out the truth." While Cassian sat with Mila beneath the crooked tree, Rowan was 3 streets away, buried in the dust and silence of the town records office, working through 9 years of paperwork with the meticulous patience of a man who had outlived several bureaucracies. The fire, according to the official record, had occurred at a residence on the eastern edge of the city. The report was thin, a handful of paragraphs, a listed cause of unknown origin, and a note confirming one fatality, Elise Hart, 26 years old. Rowan frowned and requested the death certificate. There wasn't one. He checked again, certain of a filing error, working backward through the archive's ledgers, cross-referencing names, dates, addresses. Every other fire that decade had left behind the expected trail: certificates, insurance claims, follow-up inspections. Elise Hart's file had none of it. Just the initial report and then silence, as though the woman had been erased from the record the moment the fire was declared. That wasn't bureaucratic carelessness. That was deliberate. Rowan sat back slowly, the weight of it settling over him. Someone had gone through considerable effort to make sure that no one ever went looking for Elise Hart again. Not her fate, not her body, not the truth of what had actually happened that night. The fire story hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a cover. He was gathering his notes to bring the news to Cassian when a final folder, buried at the bottom of the archive box and marked only with the year, caught his eye. Inside was a single surviving newspaper clipping, its edges brittle and yellowed, reporting on a string of unexplained fires across the city that same season. Rowan almost set it aside. Then he saw the photograph printed alongside the article, grainy, half-ruined by age, showing the smoking ruin of a building and a small crowd of onlookers gathered at a safe distance. Standing at the edge of that crowd, watching the flames with an expression the camera had somehow captured with unsettling clarity, was a man Rowan recognized immediately. Victor Crow. Rowan's blood ran cold. Rowan returned to the manor before dawn, the newspaper clipping clutched carefully in a leather folio, and found Cassian still awake in his study, staring into a fire that had long since burned low. "You need to see this." Cassian took the clipping without a word. His eyes settled on the photograph, on the man standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the flames with an expression that held no shock, no horror, only satisfaction. "Victor Crow," Cassian said quietly, and the name came out like something rotten. "You know him?" "Every vampire of standing knows him." Cassian set the clipping down carefully, though his hand wasn't entirely steady. "He leads one of the largest hunter organizations left in the region. Ruthless, methodical. He doesn't kill for revenge or glory. He kills for information, for advantage." Rowan's jaw tightened. Then this wasn't a random attack. "No!" Cassian's voice had gone dangerously flat. "This was planned, executed, and covered up well enough that no one asked questions for 9 years. Rowan spent the following 2 days pulling every thread he could find on Crow's movements from that period. Old Hunter Network chatter whispered rumors among the few informants still willing to speak with a vampire's envoy. Fragments of intelligence Cassian's court had gathered and discarded as unimportant at the time. Slowly, a picture assembled itself, and it was worse than either of them had expected. 9 years ago, rumors had begun circulating among the Hunter underground. Rumors of a second blood medallion, a twin to the one worn by the Vampire King himself. Most hunters dismissed it as myth. Victor Crow did not. He believed, with the particular obsession of a man who had spent his life chasing vampire secrets, that the matching medallion wasn't merely a royal heirloom. He believed it was a key, a way to locate the hidden entrance to the vampire kingdom itself, a sanctuary that had remained concealed from human eyes for 1,000 years. And somehow, impossibly, he had learned that a young nurse named Elise Hart possessed it. "He didn't kill her," Rowan said grimly, laying the last of his findings across Cassian's desk. "The fire was staged to cover her disappearance, not her death. If he believed she held the key to the kingdom, he wouldn't have destroyed her. He would have kept her alive. He would have needed her alive. He would have needed her alive." Cassian's hands curled slowly into fists atop the desk, the wood creaking faintly beneath the pressure. 9 years. 9 years. while he had assumed Elise dead and mourned a debt he believed he'd failed to honor. She might have been alive, imprisoned, interrogated, held by a man who wanted to tear open the last sanctuary his people had left. Where is he keeping her? Cassian's voice had dropped to something low and lethal. I don't know yet. Crow's operation is scattered across half a dozen fronts. It will take time to trace. Then we don't have time to waste. He hadn't meant for Mila to hear any of it. She had come to the manor that afternoon at Mrs. Bellamy's reluctant permission, delighted by the invitation and utterly unaware of the storm gathering around her. Cassian had intended to keep her far from the study, from the maps and the names, and the grim calculations being made behind closed doors. But children, he was reminded once again, had a talent for appearing exactly where adults least expected them. She stood frozen in the study doorway, a half-eaten biscuit still in her hand, having caught only fragments, alive, kept alive, kicked him key, but fragments enough. My mother's alive? Her voice was very small. Cassian turned, and for a moment he considered, foolishly, trying to soften what she'd overheard. He decided against it. She had earned better than a comforting lie. We believe so, he said gently. We believe a man took her 9 years ago because he thought she held something valuable. We don't yet know where he's kept her, but we intend to find out. Mila's eyes filled slowly, the biscuit forgotten in her trembling hand. If she's alive, her voice cracked. Why didn't she come home? Why didn't she come find me? The question landed like a blow. Cassian crossed the room and knelt in front of her, bringing himself down to her height, something he hadn't done for anyone, human or otherwise, in longer than he could remember. Because she couldn't, he said quietly. Not because she stopped loving you. Not because she stopped trying. If what we believe is true, someone has kept her from you every single day since that fire, against her will, and she has likely spent every one of those days thinking of nothing but getting back to you. Mila's breath hitched, tears finally spilling over. You promise? Cassian held her gaze, steady and unwavering, the way he might once have sworn an oath before his own court. I promise you, he said. We are going to bring her back. Mila threw her arms around his neck without warning, and Cassian, king of a kingdom older than the city surrounding them, sat frozen in an entirely different way than he had at the cafe, undone not by shock, but by the fierce, trembling grip of a child who had finally allowed herself to hope. Rowan watched from the doorway, quiet, until his eyes drifted to the small wooden pendant still hanging from Mila's neck, swinging gently as she clung to Cassian. Something about it caught the firelight strangely. He stepped closer, frowning, and gently, carefully, turned the pendant over in his fingers while Mila remained lost in Cassian's embrace. There, along the inside curve of the wood, nearly invisible unless the light struck it just right, were symbols, small, deliberate, carved with painstaking care into a surface that had looked, until this exact moment, like nothing more than an ordinary child's keepsake. Rowan's breath caught. Cassian, he said slowly, you need to look at this. Cassian crossed the room in 3 strides, and Mila, still sniffling but curious now, loosened her grip enough to let him see what Rowan had found. He took the pendant carefully, tilting it toward the firelight the way Rowan had, and felt something cold settle in his chest. The symbols were faint, worn by years of small fingers running over the wood without ever knowing what they touched. But they were unmistakable. Cassian reached beneath his collar and drew out the blood medallion he'd worn every day for 600 years, holding it beside the pendant. The carvings matched, not similar, not coincidental. The same hand had made both, small looping marks that mirrored the engravings hidden along the inner rim of the medallion, symbols so old that even Cassian's own scholars had long since stopped trying to translate them. She copied it, Rowan said quietly, staring at the 2 objects side by side. Before she gave you back the medallion, or after she was taken, somehow, she copied the markings onto this. Not copied. Cassian turned the pendant slowly, and understanding settled over him like a physical weight. Encoded? Look, this isn't a mirror of the medallion's markings. It's arranged differently, rotated, layered. He glanced up. This isn't decoration. It's a message. They worked through the night, Rowan sketching the markings onto parchment while Cassian cross-referenced them against the medallion's own hidden inscriptions, the two patterns slowly overlapping into something neither symbol could convey alone. By the time the candle had burned low, a shape had emerged from the tangle of lines. Not words, but a route. Landmarks. Directions, patient and deliberate, leading north into terrain neither of them recognized offhand, but Rowan's old maps confirmed as mountainous, remote, and largely unmapped. "She left a trail," Cassian said, something breaking slightly in his voice, not for Mila to follow. She was too young to understand it. She left it for whoever might come looking on Mila's behalf. She knew someone would eventually find the pendant and know what to do with it. She trusted the promise. Rowan said quietly, "Even after everything, she believed you'd honor it." Cassian said nothing for a long moment, staring at the coded map now fully assembled on the desk. 9 years of silence, and Elise had never once stopped hoping someone loyal would find her daughter and follow the path she'd left behind. "We leave at first light," he said. The journey north took the better part of 3 days, winding through quiet valleys and half-forgotten roads that Rowan navigated with the pendant's markings spread across his lap. Cassian had insisted Mila travel with them rather than remain behind, not out of necessity, but because he suspected, correctly, that she would find some way to follow regardless. She proved over those 3 days to be a remarkably easy traveling companion, curious about everything, quiet when quiet was needed, and utterly unafraid of the strange, pale-haired man she now rode beside for hours at a time. "Does it hurt?" she asked on the second afternoon, watching Cassian's eyes catch the light in a way that wasn't quite human. "Being what you are?" "No," Cassian said, "though it did, once, a very long time ago, before I understood it." "Do you drink blood?" "When I must, rarely from anyone unwilling." Mila considered this with the serious focus she gave most things. "Everyone at the orphanage says vampires are monsters, that you eat people and burn in sunlight and have no hearts at all." Cassian glanced down at her, something wry tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And what do you think, having spent 3 days in the company of one?" Mila thought about it honestly, the way only a child could. "I think the scariest person I ever heard about wasn't a vampire at all. I think it was the man who took my mom." She looked up at him. "You're not scary. You're sad. There's a difference." Cassian said nothing for a while after that, though something in his chest had gone quietly, unexpectedly warm. That evening, while Mila slept curled beneath a heavy travel cloak near the fire, Rowan sat across from Cassian, turning a cup of untouched tea slowly in his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Cassian raised an eyebrow. "I thought she was a trap. I was ready to have her watched, questioned, treated as a threat because of 6 words she said in a cafe." Rowan shook his head slowly, watching the girl's small sleeping shape across the fire. "I was wrong about her. Completely wrong. She's not bait. She's the only reason any of us know Elise might still be alive." "You were being careful," Cassian said. "That's not a fault. It nearly cost us the truth." Cassian looked at his oldest friend for a long moment. "Then let it cost you nothing further. We move forward from here together, all 3 of us, and we finish what her mother started 9 years ago." Rowan nodded slowly, some old tension finally easing from his shoulders. They found it just past midnight on the 3rd day, a jagged silhouette rising against the moonlit sky, where the coded map's final markings converged half-swallowed by cliffside and shadow, so carefully hidden that 100 travelers could have passed within a mile of it and never known it existed. A fortress, carved directly into the mountain itself, its walls dark and windowless, guarded by torches that flickered like watching eyes along a ridge Rowan hadn't even realized was inhabited until they were nearly upon it. Cassian brought the group to a silent halt, staring up at the structure with a coldness settling behind his eyes. "That's it," Rowan murmured. "That's where he's keeping her." They made camp in a hollow half a mile from the fortress, hidden by rock and shadow, and Cassian sent word ahead through means only his kind possessed. By dawn, 6 of his most trusted guards had arrived, vampires who had served his family for generations, silent and disciplined, armed with blades forged to move as quickly as they did. "Mila stays with Rowan," Cassian said, kneeling before her one final time. "No matter what happens inside, you stay close to him, do you understand?" Mila nodded, her small face set with a bravery that made something ache in Cassian's chest. You'll find her? I will. The fortress had no visible entrance from the ridge, but Cassian's guards knew the old ways. Tunnels carved centuries ago by vampire hands, long before Crow's hunters had claimed the mountain for themselves. They moved through the darkness and near silence. Cassian at the front, senses stretched wide, listening for every shift of air, every heartbeat that didn't belong to his own party. The first trap nearly took one of the guards' legs off, a pressure plate connected to a swinging iron gate lined with silver-edged spikes. Cassian caught the man by the collar and hauled him back a half-second before the mechanism triggered, the gate slamming shut inches from his boots. "Careful," Cassian murmured. "Crow builds for things like us." They pressed on, deeper into the mountain, past patrol routes Rowan had mapped from old hunter chatter, until the tunnels widened into a stone corridor lit by torchlight. 2 hunters stood guard at a junction ahead, crossbows slung, murmuring quietly to each other. Cassian didn't give the order to attack. He simply moved. He crossed the distance between himself and the first hunter in a blur too fast for human eyes to track, one hand closing over the man's crossbow before he could raise it, the other pressing firmly against his throat. Not crushing, not tearing, just enough pressure to drop him unconscious to the stone floor before he could make a sound. The second hunter spun, weapon rising, and found Cassian already behind him, disarming him with a single precise motion and lowering him gently to the ground beside his companion. Neither man would wake with more than a headache. Rowan, watching from the tunnel behind with Mila's hand held tightly in his own, exhaled slowly. He'd seen Cassian's restraint countless times over the centuries, but rarely under this kind of pressure, rarely with this much at stake. "He could kill them," Mila whispered, wide-eyed. "He could," Rowan agreed quietly. "He won't. Not unless there's no other choice." They pushed deeper, but the silence didn't hold. Somewhere above them, a bell began to ring, sharp, urgent, echoing through the stone tunnels. "They know we're here," one of the guards said grimly. Cassian's expression hardened. "Then we move faster?" The corridor ahead erupted into chaos within moments. Hunters poured from side passages, crossbows firing, blades drawn, shouting orders to seal the tunnels behind them. Cassian's guards met them head-on, a blur of motion and steel in the flickering torchlight, while Cassian himself pushed forward relentlessly, cutting a path through the chaos with a speed and precision that made the hunter's training look clumsy by comparison. He was fast, elegant, every movement controlled, economical, never a wasted strike, disarming, subduing, moving past whenever he could, only meeting force with force when there was no other choice. A hunter lunged at him with a silver blade. Cassian caught the wrist, twisted it free of the weapon, and sent the man sprawling without breaking stride. Another fired a crossbow bolt point blank. Cassian was no longer standing where the bolt struck, already behind the man, disarming him before he understood what had happened. Rowan kept Mila pressed against the tunnel wall behind him, his own blade drawn, cutting down anyone who came within reach of the girl with brutal efficiency. He would apologize to no one for that. Cassian could afford elegance. Rowan could not afford to lose focus, not with Mila's small hand fisted in the back of his coat, trembling, but silent, watching everything with wide, unblinking eyes. The battle raged through the tunnels for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, hunters falling back gradually as Cassian's guards pressed the advantage, until the corridor ahead finally cleared and an old stone stairwell spiraled downward into darkness. "Underground," Cassian said, already moving. "Prison cells are always underground." They descended quickly, the sounds of battle fading above them, replaced by a heavier, colder silence. The particular stillness of a place built to keep people forgotten. The stairwell opened into a long corridor lined with iron doors, each fitted with a small barred window, the air thick with damp stone and years of neglect. Cassian moved from door to door, glancing through each barred window, his jaw tightening further with every empty cell he passed. Rowan followed close behind with Mila, her breathing quick and shallow now, her earlier bravery fraying at the edges as the reality of the place settled over her. "Almost there," Rowan murmured to her. "We're almost there. We're almost there." At the very end of the corridor stood a final door, older than the rest, its iron rusted and its lock heavier than anything they'd passed. Cassian tore it free with a single motion, the metal groaning in protest before giving way entirely. The cell beyond was small, dim, cold enough that breath should have fogged in the air. In the far corner, curled against the stone wall on a thin, threadbare blanket, was a woman. Pale, thin, her once-dark hair streaked heavily with silver that had no business being there so young, her wrists marked with the fading evidence of years spent in chains that had only recently been removed. She lifted her head slowly, as though the motion cost her more strength than she had left to give, her eyes struggling to focus in the sudden torchlight spilling through the broken door. And then she saw the small girl standing frozen in the doorway behind Rowan, staring back at her with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and desperate hope. Her cracked lips parted. Mila? Mila didn't remember crossing the cell. One moment, she was frozen in the doorway, and the next, she was on her knees on the cold stone floor, arms wrapped around a woman so thin and fragile she barely felt real. Sobbing into his shoulder, she had spent 9 years trying to remember the exact shape of. Mom. The word broke apart as it left her. Mom, it's really you. Elise's arms came around her daughter slowly, as though she couldn't quite trust that this was happening, that the girl in her arms was real and not another cruelty her mind had conjured during the long, gray years underground. But Mila was warm, solid, crying into her shoulder with a fierce, desperate grip that no dream had ever managed to fake. My girl, Elise whispered, tears finally spilling down her hollowed cheeks. My beautiful girl, you've grown so much. You're so tall. You said we'd find each other again, Mila sobbed. You said. I never stopped believing you. I know. Elise pressed her lips to the top of Mila's head, breathing her in like something precious and nearly lost. I never stopped believing it either. Not for one single day. Cassian stood back near the broken doorway, giving them the moment. Though his throat had tightened in a way he hadn't expected, Rowan lingered beside him, quiet, watching the reunion with an expression that suggested even a man who had seen 3 centuries of history unfold still wasn't immune to something this raw. It was several long minutes before Elise finally looked up over her daughter's shoulder and found Cassian's face in the torchlight. Recognition dawned slowly, then all at once. You came, she whispered. You actually came. She whispered. You actually came. Cassian stepped forward and knelt before her. The king who had once been a wounded stranger in an alley, now lowering himself to the same level as the woman who had saved his life, without asking for anything in return. I should have come sooner, he said quietly. I should have looked for you the moment I heard the fire wasn't what it seemed. I'm sorry it took 9 years and your daughter's courage to bring me here. Elise shook her head slowly, her hand still tangled protectively in Mila's hair. You came exactly like you promised. That's more than most would have done. Her voice was hoarse, worn down by years of disuse but steady. I never doubted you would, even when I stopped being able to explain to myself why I still believed it. Tell me what happened, Cassian said gently. So she did. She told him about the night everything changed. Hunters breaking into her home, a man with cold, methodical eyes who called himself Victor Crow, who hadn't wanted to kill her only to question her again and again. About the medallion he'd somehow learned she possessed. He wanted to know what it unlocked, where the hidden kingdom lay, what secret the matching halves revealed when joined together. For 9 years, he had asked. For 9 years, in various cells across various hidden fortresses, he had pressed her for an answer she genuinely didn't have. I told him the truth every time, Elise said. There was no secret, no map, no key to anything. You told me it was a promise, not a weapon. And that's all I ever believed it to be. He never accepted that answer. He thought I was protecting something. He thought if he asked enough times, in enough ways, I'd eventually break. But you never did, Cassian said quietly. There was nothing to give him, Elise said simply. Only Mila to protect, even from a distance I couldn't cross. That kept me from breaking more than any strength of my own ever could. Cassian's jaw tightened, something cold and furious settling behind his eyes. Not at Elise, but at 9 wasted years, at a man who had tortured an innocent woman chasing a secret that had never existed at all. He's finished, Cassian said. Whatever he believes that medallion holds, he's about to learn how wrong he's been. It was Rowan who noticed first. A change in the air, a stillness that didn't belong, the particular silence that came before violence rather than after it. Cassian turned, already rising, already reaching for the medallion at his chest, out of instinct rather than thought. His hand closed around nothing. The chain was gone. He spun toward the cell doorway, and there, framed against the torchlight of the corridor beyond, stood Victor Crow himself, tall, gaunt, dressed in dark leather, worn smooth by decades of hunting, his pale eyes gleaming with an expression of pure, unrestrained triumph. In his outstretched palm rested Cassian's blood medallion, its crimson stone catching the torchlight like a drop of fresh blood, and beside it, plucked with equal ease from around Elisa's neck sometime in the chaos of reunion neither of them had noticed, lay its long-hidden twin. 9 years, Victor said softly, almost reverently, turning the two halves over in his palm. 9 years of asking the wrong question to the wrong woman when all I needed to do was wait for the king himself to walk both halves directly into my hand. Crow, Cassian's voice was low, lethal, every trace of gentleness gone from it entirely. Victor smiled, slow and cold, as he pressed the two halves of the blood medallion together in his palm. For a moment, nothing happened. No light, no sound, no revelation. Then, faintly, the crimson stones began to glow. Victor's laughter echoed through the underground corridor, wild and triumphant, the sound of a man who believed after 9 long years that he had finally won everything he'd ever wanted. Now, he said, I own the entrance to your kingdom. The glow faded almost as quickly as it had come. Victor stood frozen in the doorway, staring down at the two joined halves of the blood medallion in his palm, waiting for something more. A rumble of stone, a hidden door, a map burned into light, waiting for the moment 9 years of obsession had promised him. Nothing happened. The medallion simply sat there, whole for the first time in centuries, its crimson stones catching the torchlight like any other piece of old, beautiful jewelry. No hidden gate, no revealed kingdom, no secret at all. No, Victor whispered. He turned the joined halves over in his hands, pressing them harder together, as though force alone might coax the answer from them. No, there has to be more. There has to be something. There isn't, Cassian said quietly. Victor's head snapped up, fury replacing confusion in an instant. You're lying. 9 years I chased this. 9 years I tore apart everything that woman had, everything her daughter would have grown up with, because there had to be something worth all of it. You chased a story you told yourself, Cassian said, stepping forward slowly, his voice steady despite the medallion sitting in his enemy's hand. The blood medallion was never a key to anything, Crow. It was never meant to unlock a kingdom or reveal a hidden gate. It was forged as a symbol. Nothing more, nothing less. A promise between my family and anyone who ever proved themselves worthy of our protection. Honor, friendship, a vow that outlives the person who makes it. You expect me to believe that? Victor's voice had gone ragged, something close to desperation, bleeding through the fury. A king doesn't give away half of his most sacred treasure over a symbol. There's always a mechanism, always a purpose. There was a purpose, Cassian said. Elise saved my life and asked for nothing in return. I gave her that medallion because it was the only thing I owned valuable enough to match what she'd given me. That's all it was ever meant to be. You spent 9 years torturing a woman, terrorizing a child, burning down a home and a name, chasing a secret that existed only in your own certainty that vampires never do anything without hidden motive. Victor's hands had begun to shake, the medallion trembling in his grip. Behind him, in the corridor, several of his own hunters had gathered to watch the confrontation, and Cassian saw something shift across their faces as his words settled into the silence. Doubt. Then something worse than doubt. Realization. He's telling the truth, one of the hunters murmured, low enough that Victor almost didn't hear it. There's nothing here. There was never anything here. Quiet. Victor snapped. We lost men in that fire 9 years ago, another voice said. Harder this time. We lost men in the raids since, all chasing a kingdom that was never behind that medallion at all. Victor rounded on his own followers, fury contorting his face. It doesn't matter what he says. He's a vampire. Lying is bred into their blood, but the doubt had already taken root, and Cassian watched it spread through the gathered hunters like fire through dry grass. These were men who had followed Victor Crow for years, who had bled and killed and lost friends chasing his vision of a hidden vampire stronghold, ripe for conquest. And now, staring at a joined medallion that did nothing but catch torchlight, they were beginning to understand exactly what their loyalty had cost them. One hunter lowered his weapon first, then another. Within moments, half the men who had entered that corridor behind Victor were backing slowly away, unwilling to spill more blood for a secret that had just been proven, definitively, to have never existed. Victor's composure finally shattered entirely. "Cowards," he spat at his retreating men, before turning back to Cassian with something wild and unmoored in his eyes. "If there's no kingdom to claim, then I'll settle for revenge instead." He lunged. Cassian met him without hesitation, catching Victor's wrist before the blade in his other hand could find its mark, twisting hard enough to force the weapon from his grip. Victor fought with the desperate, reckless strength of a man who had nothing left to lose, but 9 years of obsession had made him predictable, and Cassian had spent 6 centuries learning patience against far more dangerous opponents. The fight was brief, and, in the end, almost anticlimactic. Cassian disarmed him a second time, then a third, driving him back against the stone wall of the corridor with controlled, deliberate force until Victor had no leverage left, no weapon, no followers remaining to intervene. "It's over, Crow," Cassian said quietly, pinning him firmly but without cruelty. "It was over the moment you joined those two halves together and found nothing waiting for you." Victor sagged against the wall, the fight finally draining out of him, replaced by something hollow and exhausted. Rowan moved forward with restraints, binding the hunter's wrists with practiced efficiency, while 2 of Cassian's guards secured the remaining hunters who hadn't already fled into the tunnels. Victor didn't resist. He simply stared at the reunited medallion, now resting in Cassian's palm once more, as though he still couldn't quite comprehend that it held nothing at all. "All of it," he muttered. For nothing," Cassian agreed, without satisfaction. Behind him, Elise held Mila close, both of them watching the scene with quiet, exhausted relief. Rowan finished securing the last of the restraints and glanced toward Cassian, waiting. "What happens now?" he asked. Cassian looked down at the joined medallion one final time before separating it back into its 2 halves, pressing one gently back into Elise's waiting palm. "Now," he said, "the truth stops being a secret." He turned to face what remained of Victor's scattered followers, his voice carrying clearly through the stone corridor. "I intend to make certain the entire region knows exactly what this medallion is and exactly what it is not. No more men will die chasing a myth. No more families will be destroyed searching for a kingdom that was never hidden behind a piece of jewelry." His eyes settled on Victor, cold and final. "The truth ends here, Crow, publicly, where it should have started." Victor Crow was handed over to the regional authorities within the week, along with enough evidence, recovered from his own fortress records, corroborated by the testimony of hunters who had abandoned him in that underground corridor to ensure he would never again lead men into another family's home. The truth spread faster than Cassian expected. He hadn't announced it from a throne or a proclamation carved in stone. He simply stopped hiding it. He allowed the story to be told plainly without exaggeration to anyone who asked. A young nurse 9 years ago who had saved a wounded stranger without knowing what he was, and a king who had spent 9 years quietly determined to honor what he owed her. Word moved through the city the way word always did, from neighbor to neighbor, market stall to market stall, until it settled into something larger than gossip. People who had grown up fearing vampires without ever meeting one began, cautiously, to reconsider what they thought they knew. Not everyone changed their minds. Old fears rarely dissolved so easily, but something shifted, quietly, in the way the city spoke about its king, less as a distant, dangerous myth, and more as something that had, at least once, proven itself capable of gratitude. Hope Haven released Mila into her mother's custody within days, the paperwork moving with unusual speed once Mrs. Bellamy learned the truth of what had actually happened 9 years earlier. She cried when she said goodbye to Mila, holding the girl tightly at the orphanage gate. "I always knew you were stubborn for a reason," she said, smiling through her tears. "I just didn't know it was this good a reason." Mila hugged every child in the courtyard before she left, promising Toby she'd visit even though everyone suspected she wouldn't need to. Not really. Not with an entire new life waiting for her. Cassian offered Elise and Mila a home within his own household. Quiet apartments, away from court protection from anyone who might still wish them harm. Resources enough that neither of them would ever again know the particular desperation of a locked door and an empty cupboard. Elise accepted the protection gratefully, though she declined anything resembling luxury, insisting on a small cottage instead, modest and sunlit, close enough to the city that Mila could still visit her friends whenever she wished. The city, in its own quiet way, wanted to celebrate what had happened. Word came to Cassian's court of gatherings being planned in his honor. Feasts, processions, public ceremonies to commemorate the king who had crossed a mountain to keep a promise. Cassian refused every one of them. "I don't want a parade," he told Rowan, when his old friend brought him the third such proposal that week. "I don't want songs written about it, or statues, or speeches praising my honor." "Then what do you want?" Cassian considered the question for a long moment, watching through his study window as Mila chased something across the garden below, laughing, her mother watching from a bench nearby with an expression of quiet, hard-won peace. "I want people to understand that kindness matters," he said finally. "Not because it earns reward or recognition." Elise never expected anything when she knelt beside a dying stranger in an alley. She simply did what was right, and it changed everything that came after. For her, for her daughter, for me. I don't want a celebration of a king's honor. I want people to remember that an ordinary act of decency, offered without expectation, can echo across decades and change more lives than anyone could have predicted. "And the medallion?" Rowan asked. "What becomes of that?" "It stays what it was always meant to be," Cassian said. "Not a treasure, not a weapon, a promise. Given freely, kept faithfully. I want it known as that from now on. A symbol that trust between our two worlds is possible, when it's built honestly, when pressed by the few dignitaries who still insisted on some form of official recognition. Cassian offered only a single, simple statement, one that would eventually be repeated throughout the city far more often than any elaborate proclamation could have managed. "I simply honored a promise." Weeks later, on a warm afternoon much like the one that had started everything, Cassian found himself once again at a small table outside Café de Lumière, a porcelain cup of black coffee steaming gently in front of him. He hadn't planned it deliberately, though perhaps some part of him had. The same table. The same soft afternoon light stretching amber stripes across the cobblestones. The same street, busy with strangers who had no idea what had unfolded 9 years and several weeks in the making, right there on that sidewalk. Elise sat beside him, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, her hair no longer streaked with the pallor of imprisonment color.